The sound of paper tearing echoed through the glass, walled room like a cold blade cutting through the air. Elias Monroe, a 40-year-old black man and CEO of Nexora Technologies, stood tall, his dark eyes burning, his hand clenched tightly around the $30 million contract termination notice. His voice rang out, sharp as steel. "You threw me out of a first-class seat because of the color of my skin. Today, I am cutting off all cooperation with Aurelia Air." The silence pressed heavily over the entire hall. Faces once smug and indifferent turned pale. Some eyes dropped toward the polished wooden table as if searching for an escape. No one dared breathe too loudly. In a single moment, all power shifted from those who thought they controlled the board to the very man they had scorned on yesterday's flight. But to understand the weight behind every word Elias spoke, one must return to the blood, sweat, and humiliation that carved his journey. Elias Monroe was not born with polished shoes or leather chairs in glass towers at his back. He came from South Chicago, where ambulance sirens rang more often than church bells, where children learned to dodge violence before they learned to write their first letters. His father, a worn-down man, was sentenced to prison when Elias was just 7, the punishment harsher because of the color of his skin. His mother, Gloria, worked 3 jobs at once, cleaning houses, running a cash register on night shifts, then selling at flea markets the next morning. Her hands were calloused, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Yet each night she whispered to her son as she tucked him in, "You must be different from them. You must go further than I ever could." In their cramped apartment, the only light came from an old desk lamp. Elias bent over math books for hours into the night, long after the neighborhood sank into darkness. He studied with the desperation of someone who knew knowledge was the only key that could unlock the prison of his life. Years later, that effort blossomed into a partial scholarship to MIT. But even in that temple of intellect, Elias had to work 2 jobs to cover the rest. Days in lectures, nights scrubbing kitchens, weekends on overnight shifts in laboratories. His white classmates, less talented, landed contracts with ease from major firms. He, with a flawless transcript and groundbreaking innovations, received rejection letter after rejection letter. The silence of the job market said more than words. They did not believe a black man could lead the technology of the future. Yet Elias refused to quit. In a shoebox apartment, he spread a thin mattress on the floor, lived on instant noodles for weeks, and juggled maxed-out credit cards. There he wrote line after line of code, building the algorithms that would later become the foundation of Nexora Technologies. 12 years later, Nexora had become a $2 billion tech empire, leading the world in artificial intelligence solutions for supply chain management. Elias himself stood as a living symbol of the American dream, a dream he had fought for and clawed into existence inch by inch. On a crisp Monday morning, a walnut desk bore the carefully stacked files of a historic deal. Apex Industries was seeking partnership with Nexora, a leap that would catapult Elias's company onto the global stage. If secured, this would be the most significant contract of his career. Kyron Gwynn, his sharp and efficient young assistant, handed him the travel itinerary. You'll be flying first class, 8 a.m. tomorrow, Aurelia Air. 3 hours in the air, enough to review all the confidential documents. She hesitated, lowering her voice. Lately, some passengers of color have complained about being moved down to economy. I just wanted you to be aware. Elias laughed, his smile filled with confidence. The navy-tailored suit fit perfectly over his broad frame. He waved off Kyra's concern. I am a platinum customer, a billionaire CEO, not someone they can just push around. Don't worry. Kyra nodded, though her eyes still carried unease. The next morning, Elias strode into O'Hare Airport with steady steps, a sleek leather case in hand carrying the merger plan. To the world, he was just another busy executive. But only he, and the past carved into his bones, knew that every step was a battle to prove he belonged anywhere he chose to stand. He had no idea that this flight, seemingly just a short trip to San Francisco, would become the storm that changed not only his career, but an entire industry. The loudspeakers chimed steadily, blending with the sound of rolling suitcases across the polished marble floor. Elias Monroe cut through the business class section of O'Hare Airport like a sharp arrow. His navy suit fit perfectly against his tall frame, his silver-gray tie knotted neatly, his hair combed to precision. He carried himself with the air of a man long accustomed to holding the highest place in any room. But only minutes later, Elias recognized a look he knew all too well, the same look that had followed him throughout his childhood in Chicago, a stare half suspicious, half dismissive. The nameplate on the man behind the check, in desk, read, Colin Mercer. Pale, skinned, with cold eyes that lingered a half-second too long on the color of Elias's skin. Ticket and ID, Colin said flatly, without looking up. Elias smiled politely, handing over his passport and digital ticket. He was no stranger to procedure, but he noticed the way Colin held his documents longer than necessary, turning the ticket as though hunting for some invisible flaw. The white businessman who passed before him had taken no more than 10 seconds. For Elias, every drawn-out moment felt like an interrogation. Finally, Colin gave a slight nod. Everything seems fine. His voice stressed the words. Seems fine, leaving suspicion hanging in the air. Elias reclaimed his documents with a nod of thanks, though unease was already stirring inside his chest. When he entered the business class lounge, another difference struck him. Staff greeted white passengers with practiced warmth, calling them by name, bowing slightly, offering to pour wine. When Elias approached, the receptionist barely glanced at his boarding pass before curtly saying, "Coffee machines on the left. Water is self-serve." No attempt to remember his name, not even a courtesy smile. Elias exhaled softly and chose a quiet corner. He set his leather briefcase by his feet, opened his laptop, and buried himself in the merger plan with Apex Industries. Don't let the small things distract you, Elias, he told himself. Today is too important. But the unease crept in regardless. Every gesture in the lounge seemed to whisper that he still did not belong. When the loudspeaker announced boarding for first-class passengers at Gate 12, Elias gathered his things and walked to the gate. There, a familiar face reappeared. Colin Mercer, chatting with a flight attendant. The attendant, Bethany Reed wore a thin smile sharp as a blade. She glanced at Elias, whispered something into Colin's ear, and when Elias's eyes caught theirs, both quickly pretended to study the computer. Bethany's half-smile curled as Elias stepped forward. "Good morning," Elias said, keeping his tone cordial. Colin said nothing, only extended his hand. Elias presented his phone with the QR code. Colin examined it like counterfeit currency before the scanner flashed green. "All set. First class, seat 2A, Colin said, still refusing eye contact. The first-class cabin of Aurelia Air was a world of velvet luxury, leather seats, chilled champagne, warm golden lights. Elias slid his briefcase beneath the seat, fastened his belt, and leaned back. He tried to focus on numbers and strategies, but Bethany's eyes lingered on him, as though to remind him he was an intruder in this space. She stepped forward with her scanner. "Boarding pass, sir." Elias raised a brow. "I already presented it at the gate." Still, he pulled up the code again. Bethany scrutinized it closely, her gaze flicking back to him before she gave a faint nod and smirked. Elias noticed what was obvious. She had not asked a single other passenger to show their ticket again. Only him. 10 minutes later, Bethany returned, her voice even. "Sorry, we need to recheck your seat. There's been a system glitch." Elias frowned slightly but kept his voice calm. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. Is there a problem?" Bethany gave no direct answer. She bent over the screen, then walked away. Elias glanced around. The other passengers, mostly white businessmen in expensive suits, were sipping champagne, reading newspapers, reclining in comfort. None were asked to show tickets twice. Only him, Elias Munro, billionaire CEO, was being treated as though he had forced his way in. A thought flickered in his mind. Could Kyra have been right? He leaned back, fingers tightening against the edge of his seat. An uneasy feeling swept over him, quiet and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. What Elias did not know was that in just a few minutes, another man would stride into the cabin, a familiar rival from the tech industry, who would become the spark that ignited a fury, forcing the entire airline to pay a devastating price. The first-class cabin was nearly full. Elias Munro sat quietly in seat 2A, the wide window seat, his hands resting on a stack of confidential documents. The scent of wine, the clink of crystal glasses, the low laughter of white businessmen around him, all of it blended into a scene of perfection. Yet Elias still felt the invisible tension tightening around him. Bethany Reed returned. This time her demeanor was no longer casual. Her voice was steady, deliberate, almost as though she were reading from a script. "Mr. Munro, I'm sorry. There's been a system error. Your seat is not 2A. You've been reassigned to row 28, economy class." The air in the cabin froze. A few curious eyes turned toward Elias. He raised his brows, his voice low and precise. "Row 28. This is the confirmation I received from your airline. Seat 2A, first class. I paid for it. Right here." He pulled up his phone, the screen glowing with the confirmation email, the seat number displayed clearly. He held it out to Bethany. She glanced at it for only a second before closing her tablet and replying coldly, "Our system doesn't match. I'll need you to move immediately and make this seat available for the passenger who booked it." Just then, hurried footsteps echoed down the aisle. A man appeared, breathless but exuding confidence. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie crooked, his phone still pressed to his ear. His booming voice carried across the cabin. "Did you hear me? I have to be on this flight. Don't let Carter deal fall apart because I can't make it to Geneva." Elias didn't need more than a glance to recognize him. Lucas Grant, Vice President of Vector Tech, Nexora's fiercest rival. A notorious predator, known for swooping in to sabotage competitors' deals. Bethany turned to Colin Mercer, who had followed Lucas into the cabin. Their eyes met in a brief but loaded exchange. Then Colin stepped toward Elias, his face bending into a false smile. "Mr. Monroe, I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. The system shows seat 2A belongs to Mr. Grant. Your seat is 28C, economy class. Please cooperate so we can depart on time." Heat pounded against Elias's temples. He inhaled deeply, forcing his voice to stay calm, though each word weighed like iron. "This is the seat I paid for. Here is the confirmation. Here is the receipt. Are you really going to erase my name from first class just because he arrived late?" Lucas stood there, smirking, a glass of champagne already in his hand. "Is there a problem? I really need to take my seat." Elias locked eyes with him. "This is my seat." The atmosphere grew suffocating. Some white passengers shifted irritably at the delay, but none spoke up. A few looked at Elias with pity, others avoided his gaze as though he were the one causing trouble. Bethany tilted her head, her voice soft but loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "If you continue to resist, we'll have to call security. You wouldn't want to be escorted out in front of everyone, would you?" The threat cut through Elias like an icy blade. In that instant, he remembered his mother, bent over scrubbing floors under dim lights, whispering to her son, "Never let them break you." Elias closed his eyes, then opened them. He saw the choices clearly. Fight to the end, risk being dragged off the plane, and miss the apex meeting. Or swallow the humiliation, move to economy, and keep the billion-dollar deal alive. He chose the latter, not out of fear, but because he knew. Whether it was revenge or justice, timing was everything. His voice rasped from the effort of restraint. "I want the full names of everyone involved. I will be demanding an official written explanation from this airline." Bethany smirked, nodding as though his words meant nothing. Elias rose. The leather briefcase in his hand felt as heavy as lead. He walked the aisle, past each row of first-class seats, past averted eyes and muffled whispers. He felt it with each step. In their eyes, he had never truly belonged here. The journey from seat 2A to row 28 stretched like a lifetime. Every step, every glance turned away, every quiet chuckle carved itself into his memory like a blade. When Elias finally sat in the cramped middle seat of economy, the seat in front reclined almost into his lap. To his right, an elderly woman wore headphones. To his left, a young woman looked at him with something different, an expression of empathy. She leaned close and whispered, "That was wrong. I saw everything. I'm Ava Martinez. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I recorded the video." Elias turned to her, stunned. In Ava's eyes, he didn't see pity, but the fire of someone who knew the truth had to be exposed. His heart pounded. He didn't yet know how that video would change everything. But in that moment, in the midst of humiliation, a spark flickered, the spark of justice waiting for the right moment to ignite. The plane landed in San Francisco 45 minutes late. For a first-class passenger, that would hardly matter. They would disembark quickly, take their private car, and still make it to their meeting on time. But not Elias Munro. Pushed down to seat 28C, he had to wait as dozens of rows shuffled one by one through the narrow aisle. Each passing minute felt like a blade twisting into his stomach. By the time Elias finally stepped off the plane, the clock had passed 10 a.m. He rushed into the crowded taxi line. On the way, his phone rang. The receptionist from Apex spoke through the speaker, her voice uneasy. "Mr. Munro, the Apex board has been waiting for over 15 minutes. They're beginning to wonder if you're still coming." Elias closed his eyes, hiding his heavy breathing. "Please tell them I'm on my way. I'll be there as soon as possible." But inside, he knew. A first meeting demanded punctuality as the most basic courtesy. And he had failed, not from carelessness, but from humiliation disguised as a system error. When Elias entered the gleaming glass headquarters of Apex Industries, the clock was nearing 10:30. The receptionist led him into the boardroom. There, 5 stern faces were already waiting. 4 vice presidents and CEO Jonathan Reed, a man infamous for his severity. Reed tapped his fingers on the table, his eyes cold as steel. "Mr. Munro, we were beginning to think you had changed your mind." Elias straightened his tie, forcing composure. "I apologize. There was an unexpected incident on my flight that delayed me. I take full responsibility." No one replied. The air in the room thickened with suspicion. Elias powered up the projector, beginning his presentation. But in his mind, images kept colliding. Bethany's sneering smile, Colin's false politeness, and Lucas Grant sipping champagne in seat 2A. His hand trembled as he flipped the slides. He misread a crucial financial figure. The energy in the room shifted. Reed cut in, his voice sharp and cold. "Mr. Munro, is this the carefully prepared plan? You promised us. From a leading technology firm, I expect precision, not fumbling." Elias swallowed hard. He knew he was more intelligent than anyone in that room. But today, all they saw was a black man arriving late, flustered and sweating. One vice president leaned forward. "Forgive me, but I must ask. Did you just say you were forced out of your first-class seat into economy? Are you implying discrimination?" Elias paused for several seconds. Every eye was fixed on him. This was the moment. To speak the truth, or to stay silent and avoid being judged for playing the race card. Finally, he answered, "Yes, I paid for seat 2A. They took it back and gave it to a white passenger. I have confirmation and a witness." An uneasy silence filled the room. Reed coughed softly and waved a hand. "That's unfortunate. But we are here to discuss business, not airline service." Elias pressed on with his presentation, but the energy was gone. His numbers, accurate as they were, carried no weight. The eyes of the Apex executives were cold, skeptical. The negotiation, he knew, was slipping away. In that moment, his phone buzzed. A message from Ava Martinez, the civil rights lawyer who had sat next to him on the plane. "I have clear video. This was blatant discrimination. Call me if you want to act." Elias slipped the phone back into his pocket. Another message lit up immediately after, and his chest tightened. "FYI, the man who took your seat, Lucas Grant. He talked about Carter deal the whole flight. Carter is the code name for the Apex deal, isn't it? A chill ran down Elias's spine. The stolen seat was not just about racial discrimination. It was industrial espionage. Lucas had enjoyed 3 full hours in seat 2A, 3 hours to spy on every document Elias had prepared for this meeting. Jonathan Reed set down his pen, his voice low but cutting. "Mr. Monroe, we've received word that details of this deal have leaked. Some information known only to you is now in the hands of a competitor. We have no choice but to suspend negotiations until this is investigated." Elias felt the room spin. He wanted to shout the truth, to name Lucas Grant and Aurelia Eyre as the culprits. But looking at the faces around the table, he knew they already doubted him. Any protest now would only weaken his position further. The meeting ended in icy silence. As he walked out of Apex headquarters, Elias knew the billion-dollar deal had vanished into smoke, all because of one seat. That night, in his hotel room, Elias sat alone before the screen. Ava's video played, the moment he was forced out of first class, Bethany's mocking tone in the service cabin, Colin's insistence of a system error. Hearing it again, Elias felt a mix of humiliation and fury. But within that despair, a spark flickered. This was no longer about him alone. It was about an entire system that enabled discrimination. And if Lucas Grant dared to exploit that to destroy his career, Elias could turn it into a weapon, a strike that would bring the airline itself to its knees. He stared out at the night skyline of San Francisco. The pain in his eyes was gone, replaced by the fire of resolve. He whispered, "You chose the wrong man to humiliate." The morning light crept into a San Francisco hotel room, but Elias Monroe sat motionless at the desk. On his laptop screen, a new email from Ava Martinez glowed. The subject line was simple: "You need to see this." Elias clicked. A series of attachments opened, complaints from other black passengers, all naming Aurelia Eyre. The stories were disturbingly similar. First, class seats downgraded to economy, repeated demands to present tickets, excessive scrutiny, while white passengers breezed through. Every word was another fragment of a larger picture: systemic discrimination. Elias closed his eyes. The quiet rage in his chest ignited into resolve. This was no longer about a stolen seat. This was about a rotten structure. He started a video call with Kyra Nguyen, his loyal assistant. Her face appeared on screen, eyes filled with concern. "You're not flying back to Chicago right away?" she asked. "No," Elias said firmly. "We're staying in San Francisco. I want everything on Aurelia Eyre. Kyra, gather our legal and financial teams. I want to know exactly what this company is built on." Kyra's fingers flew across the keyboard, her expression hardening. "Understood. I'll bring in Jordan, our CFO, and Lisa from HR. We'll convene a crisis meeting at noon." By mid-morning, another message came from Ava. "This is just the surface. I've sued airlines before, but Aurelia has the worst track record. 37 complaints in 2 years. Everyone buried under non-disclosure agreements." Elias frowned. These weren't just statistics. Behind each case was a human being forced to leave their seat, carrying the same humiliation he had felt. How many had the strength to fight? How many had stayed stunned because they lacked power? At noon, the emergency meeting began. One by one, Nexora's senior leaders appeared on screen. Jordan, the CFO, opened. "We spend about $12 million a year on Aurelia Air, just for Nexora's staff. Add in our subsidiaries, and that's closer to 20 million. Our partner firms account for another 10. That means we indirectly control $30 million of their annual revenue." Lisa from HR spoke next. "We pulled internal records on the 2 employees involved in Elias's case, Colin Mercer and Bethany Reed. Both had multiple complaints filed against them. Colin, 7. Bethany, 12. All of them suppressed by management." More evidence flashed on screen. Internal Aurelia emails with the phrase, "Maintain the traditional first-class experience." Innocuous on the surface, but everyone knew what traditional really meant. White, male, wealthy. Elias's fists clenched. Heat surged through his veins. So they didn't just humiliate me. They created a culture that encourages discrimination. Kira cut in. "There's more. We confirmed that Lucas Grant, the man who took your seat, has direct family ties to Aurelia Air's CEO, Gregory Palmer. They're brothers, in law. That explains why he was prioritized over you." The virtual room fell silent. The pieces clicked into place. What had happened to Elias was not an accident. It was deliberate. The family of Aurelia's CEO, colluding with VectorTech's executive to sabotage a $1 billion Apex deal. Elias stood, his shadow stretching across the wall. His voice no longer wavered. They didn't just commit racism. They aided corporate espionage. They sabotaged a multi-billion-dollar deal. This is no longer personal. This is war. The Nexora team was silent, then nodded in unison. Jordan spoke bluntly. "What do you want us to do?" Elias stared directly into the camera, his words sharp as steel. "I want everything. Financials, contracts, past scandals, witnesses. Peel back every layer. Find their weakest point. And when we strike, they won't see it coming." That night, alone in his hotel room, Elias replayed Ava's video. He listened to Bethany's mocking words in the galley. "Can you believe it? That black man thought he belonged in first class." The cruel laughter looped like a haunting refrain. Elias closed his eyes. Memories surged back. His mother's calloused hands, his father's raspy voice before prison took him. "Never let them see you bow." Tears welled up, but only for a moment. Elias wiped them dry and lifted his head. He knew this was the moment to turn humiliation into power. He whispered into the night, carving the vow into the air itself. They humiliated the wrong man. This time, I will not stand up just for myself. I will stand up for everyone. 3 days after returning to Chicago, Elias Monroe called an emergency meeting of the Nexora Technologies Board of Directors. On the 40th floor, the glass tower glowed brightly, the long walnut table gleaming beneath the skyline view. But no one paid attention to the scenery. The air in the room was thick, heavy. Elias walked in, his black suit sharp, his dark eyes carrying an unusual energy, not just anger, but a cold determination. He set a thick folder on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias began, his voice resonant, "I was stripped of my first-class seat by Aurelia Air, so they could hand it to our competitor. As a result, a $1 billion deal with Apex collapsed. But this is not just a personal humiliation. This is a system of organized racial discrimination. And worse, it is an act of industrial espionage." Eyes around the table shifted. Some directors rested their chins in their hands. Others frowned deeply. Elias signaled to Kira. She turned on the projector. On the screen, Ava Martinez's video played. Bethany Reed's harsh tone. Colin Mercer inventing a system error. Then Lucas Grant strolling in to seize seat 2A with a smug smile. The room fell silent, no one daring to breathe. Lisa, head of human resources, spoke next. "This was not an isolated incident. We have recorded 37 complaints of discrimination in 2 years, all of them silenced with non-disclosure agreements. Aurelia's internal emails even state, 'Maintain the traditional first-class customer experience.'" Vanessa Wright, a long-serving board member, tapped her finger lightly on the table. "Elias, this is undoubtedly infuriating, but we are talking about one of Nexora's primary transport partners. Cutting ties could throw our operations into chaos." Elias fixed his eyes on her, unblinking. "Vanessa, if we continue flying with Aurelia, what message do we send to our employees? That their value is worth less than convenience? That justice can be sacrificed for a few first-class seats?" Across the table, Robert Kingsley, a cautious director, interjected, "The reasonable path is litigation. We have evidence. But going public would be lengthy, costly, and risky for the company's image." Elias gave a short, cold laugh, leaning forward. "I didn't come here to ask for an opinion on lawsuits. I came to demand consensus for a plan. To use Nexora's economic power to force Aurelia to change. No compromise, no cover-ups. If they refuse, we pull all $30 million in revenue and take the truth public." For a moment, the room erupted. Voices overlapped, concerns about logistical chaos clashing with nods of agreement. Jamal Rivers, one of the 2 black directors, slammed his hand on the table. "I stand with Elias. For too long, black CEOs have swallowed humiliation in silence for fear of being labeled difficult. This is the time to hold them accountable. If not Elias, then who?" His words weighed heavily on the room. All eyes turned to Elias. He drew a deep breath, lowering his voice, steady and deliberate. "I am not seeking revenge. I am seeking change. Aurelia Air must change, from staffing to procedures to culture, and Nexora will be the one to force that change." The meeting stretched for nearly 2 hours. Figures were dissected, risks debated. Finally, hands went up one by one. The vote was unanimous. Elias's plan was approved. A heavy silence hung for a beat, then broke into decisive nods. Elias rose, gathering his documents. In his mind, he heard his father's voice from long ago. "When you stand, stand for more people than just yourself." That night, Elias stood by the window of his penthouse, Chicago's skyline glittering beneath him. The city lights shimmered, but inside he felt no peace. A text from his mother appeared on his screen. How was the meeting, son? Are you all right? Elias pressed his lips together, typing a short reply. All right. I'll tell you later. He set the phone down, his eyes still locked on the darkness beyond. Ahead lay a battle that would not be easy. But this time, he had an entire board behind him, a legal team at the ready, and witnesses prepared to speak the truth. Aurelia Eyre had underestimated him, and now they would pay the price. A grey morning hung over Chicago, dark clouds pressing low as if signaling an oncoming storm. On the top floor of Nexora headquarters, Elias Monroe stepped into the grand boardroom. The space had been meticulously prepared for what promised to be a historic confrontation. On one side of the long table sat Elias, sharp-eyed Assistant Kyron Wen, Chief Counsel Benjamin Cole, and three special guests, Dr. Alicia Foster, CEO of a pharmaceutical company, Terrell Hayes, a venture capitalist, and James Carter, CFO of a retail giant. All three were black leaders who had endured experiences eerily similar to Elias, being downgraded from first class or publicly humiliated by Aurelia Eyre. In the corner, a technical crew made final checks on the cameras. Everything was powered on, ready to capture every second. On the large screen, slides were queued with evidence. Ava's video, internal emails, buried disciplinary files. Kira leaned close, whispering, "They'll be here at 10. Gregory Palmer will lead. With him, the chief legal officer, the head of operations, and..." She glanced at the documents, lips pressed tight. "Colin Mercer." At the sound of that name, a surge of anger rippled through Elias, but he forced it down. He needed calm. He needed truth to speak louder than rage. At 9:58, the glass doors opened. Gregory Palmer, CEO of Aurelia, entered. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression carried the familiar pride of a man used to owning every room he walked into. Behind him came Diane Schultz, Chief Counsel, Michael Bennett, Head of Customer Experience, and Colin Mercer, his face a mask of cold indifference, though his restless eyes betrayed unease. Palmer extended a hand with a practiced smile. "Mayor Monroe, thank you for inviting us. We value our relationship with Nexora." Elias shook his hand, but did not return the smile. His words were curt. "Please sit. We're not here to discuss contracts today. We're here to discuss justice." The air froze solid. Elias did not take his seat immediately. He pressed the remote, and the screen lit up. Footage played of Bethany Reed interrogating him, followed by Colin declaring a system error. The recording was crisp, the audio undeniable. "Your seat is 28C. Every gaze shifted toward Colin. His face flushed crimson, though he tried to steady his voice. "That was just a rare mistake," Elias cut him off. "Rare? Then what do you call 37 complaints in the last 2 years? All with the same pattern. Black passengers downgraded, harassed, while white passengers were given preference." Kyra advanced to the next slide. Internal emails with chilling lines highlighted maintain the traditional first-class customer experience. Diane Schultz's brow furrowed. "These are internal documents. Where did you—" "From your own people," Elias replied, his tone calm but his eyes sharp as blades. "Employees who could no longer stomach your toxic culture." Palmer's face remained controlled, his voice smooth. Mr. Monroe, if there truly was an issue, we're willing to offer fair compensation for the poor service you encountered. Elias laughed, the sound dry and cutting, filling the room. Fair compensation? Another hush payment? Just like the 30. 7 before it? No, Mr. Palmer. This is no longer a personal grievance. This is a systemic crime. And this time, we will not be silent. He gestured. The doors opened, and Ava Martinez entered, dressed in a black suit carrying a folder. She took a seat beside Benjamin Cole, nodding at Elias. "This is Ava Martinez, a civil rights attorney," Elias announced. "She was a direct witness on that flight and recorded everything." The room sank into heavy silence. Colin broke first, sweat beading on his forehead, lips trembling. This is staged." Ava fixed her eyes on him, her voice sharp and cold. "Staged? I was in seat 28B, right beside Mr. Monroe. My video has timestamps, unedited audio, and I have additional recordings from the galley where you laughed about a black passenger thinking he belonged in first class. Do you want me to play those now?" Colin's mouth clamped shut, his eyes darting wildly. Palmer furrowed his brow, trying to wrest back control. "Mr. Monroe, I understand your anger, but going public with this would damage both sides. Instead, we can negotiate." Elias slammed the folder on the table, his voice thunderous. "No, Mr. Palmer. This is not negotiation. This is an ultimatum. Either Aurelia reforms from the ground up, staffing, procedures, culture, or tomorrow I release every piece of evidence to the press. And Nexora, along with 6 major partners, will withdraw $30 million from your hands." The room fell into suffocating silence. Gregory Palmer, the man who had once ruled the skies of the airline industry with arrogance, was, for the first time in years, no longer in control. Elias sat down, his words slow, deliberate, each one heavy as stone. "You came here today, thinking you could bargain. But I don't need to bargain. I have the truth. I have the evidence. And I have the economic power to bring you to your knees." He locked eyes with Palmer. "You thought I was just a black passenger pushed back to row 20-8. But today, I sit in the highest seat of all, the one that decides your company's fate." The air in the room erupted, not with noise, but with a silence so tense it strangled breath. The real battle had just begun. Gregory Palmer's hand rested on the table, his long, elegant fingers that once commanded the airline industry, now trembling slightly. He drew in a deep breath, struggling to regain composure. "Mr. Monroe, what you have presented is truly grave. But I believe we can find a middle ground, a substantial settlement, lifetime privileges for you, perhaps even a seat on Aurelia's elite customer advisory board." A quiet laugh broke from Terrell Hayes. He leaned forward, his voice sharp as a blade. "Mr. Palmer, you still don't understand, do you? Elias doesn't need privileges. We're not here begging for first-class seats. We're here to force you to take responsibility." Alicia Foster nodded, her eyes blazing. "Each of us has been humiliated by your airline. Different times, the same script. None of us need free flight vouchers. What we demand is real change." Diane Schultz, Aurelia's chief counsel, quickly interjected. "Then specifically, What do you want? The dismissal of a few employees? Fine, we can review Mercer and Reed's records, but demands to restructure management, to create new positions, that is far more complex. Elias leaned forward, his dark eyes deep as a chasm. Complex, perhaps, but if not, you lose $30 million in revenue immediately. And when this story hits the press, you will lose far more. He pressed the remote. The screen lit up with mock headlines his team had prepared. Aurelia Air, the racist airline. Vector Tech Alley accused of corporate espionage. The stark white text against black background hit like hammer blows in the minds of Aurelia's executives. Colin Mercer shot to his feet, his voice cracking. Enough! I've worked here 15 years. I've never discriminated against anyone. That was just a booking glitch. Elias's voice cut cold. Then what about the 7 complaints against you? The internal emails where you mocked black passengers as not first-class material. Were those glitches too? The slide changed. Evidence glared from the screen. Colin froze, sweat dripping down his collar. Palmer's face tightened, his voice sharp. Sit down, Mercer. The air grew thick, time dripping slow. Palmer wiped his brow, then lifted his gaze, his voice lower now. All right. Tell me your terms. Elias nodded slightly at Kyra. She advanced the slides. The list appeared in bold, stark letters. Immediate termination of employees with repeated discrimination records. Appointment of a chief diversity and inclusion officer reporting directly to the board. Mandatory anti-bias training for all frontline staff. Overhaul of the booking system. Banning manual overrides without recorded justification. A public statement of admission and commitment to reform. Palmer read each line, his face draining of color. He looked up. This list is too broad. It would overturn the entire structure of the company. Elias leaned back, his voice calm yet hard as steel. Exactly. Because the current structure is what has nurtured discrimination. Diane Schultz whispered in Palmer's ear, but he brushed her aside. A moment later, his tone shifted, almost pleading. At the very least, give us time. We cannot remake everything overnight. Elias crossed his arms. You have 24 hours to respond. After that, I release every piece of evidence. A heavy silence blanketed the room. Aurelia's executives glanced at each other, then back at Palmer. He swallowed hard, as though a noose were tightening around his neck. At that moment, Sarah Reed, the flight attendant who had mocked Elias, was escorted in by security. Her face pale, eyes red. When she saw Colin, she hesitated, but then turned to Elias, her voice trembling. I want to apologize. I was wrong. I let myself get swept up in the company's attitude. I don't expect forgiveness, but I can't pretend anymore. The room fell silent. Elias looked deep into her eyes. For the first time, he saw genuine remorse. He gave a slight nod, his voice low but steady. On a personal level, you chose the right moment to admit it. But change cannot stop at an apology. It must begin within this company itself. Palmer shifted his gaze from Sarah back to Elias. For the first time in the meeting, his tone carried no arrogance. Very well. I will bring these conditions to Aurelia's board. But you must understand, you are demanding a revolution." Elias leaned forward, his voice firm, each word striking like a hammer. "No, I am not demanding. I am dictating the terms, and you will accept them because the alternative is ruin." That night, Aurelia Air's headquarters glowed unusually bright. On the top floor, the board of directors had been summoned for an emergency meeting. Gregory Palmer sat at the head of the table, his hands interlocked, his face, once the embodiment of control, now shadowed with fatigue. In front of him lay the thick dossier Elias Monroe had delivered that morning. Evidence, a list of demands, an ultimatum. One silver-haired board member slammed his hand on the table. "You expect us to agree to all of this? Fire long-standing employees, create pointless new positions, issue a public apology. This is surrender, not negotiation." Another voice cut in, laced with anxiety. "It isn't surrender. It's survival. Don't you understand? If Nexora and their 6 partners pull out, we lose $30 million overnight. Our last quarterly report was already down 15%. Do we even have enough cash to cover the new fleet payments?" The words poured gasoline onto the fire. The room erupted in shouting, anger, and fear colliding. Palmer sat still, eyes fixed on his trembling fingers. In his mind, he saw Elias, the black man forced down to seat 28C, standing before him with the authority of a judge. Palmer knew with certainty. This time, Aurelia could not use a check to silence the truth. Diane Schultz, the company's chief counsel, broke in, her voice sharp. "We need to be realistic. Monroe holds the video and the internal emails. If they go public, we won't just lose corporate clients, we'll lose the entire market. The press will shred us, our stock will collapse. There is no option but acceptance." A young director, brimming with false confidence, shook his head. "If we agree, we're essentially admitting guilt. We'll set a dangerous precedent. What stops another company from pulling the same stunt tomorrow?" Palmer raised his head, his eyes weary but firm. "The difference here is that we are guilty. This isn't a stunt. You can deny it all you like, but ask yourselves, why do the same complaints keep surfacing? Why were Mercer and Reed protected? Because we looked the other way. We cultivated a culture that allowed this to happen." The room fell into silence. No one spoke. A veteran board member sighed heavily. "Mr. Palmer, if we agree, Aurelia will no longer be the Aurelia we once knew." Palmer clenched his hands tighter, his voice low and heavy. "Perhaps that's exactly what's needed. If we refuse to change, Aurelia won't exist long enough for anyone to remember the past." He paused, then swept his eyes around the table. "We are at a crossroads. Change to survive, or cling to pride and die. Do you want this company remembered as a symbol of renewal or as a disgraceful case study in failure?" After hours of bitter debate, the final vote was cast. The result was clear. The majority agreed to accept Elias Monroe's conditions. Palmer leaned back, eyes closed. He had just steered Aurelia Air through a door of no return. But in doing so, he had also signed away the futures of long, protected allies like Mercer and Bethany Reed. The next morning, Gregory Palmer and his executive team returned to Nexora's headquarters. The grand conference room was lit once again. Elias sat waiting, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the door. Palmer entered, his face stripped of its diplomatic smile. He placed a folder on the table. "The board of Aurelia has decided. We accept your terms with 2 minor adjustments. We require 60 days to fully overhaul the booking system, and the public statement will be drafted to avoid language that may be misinterpreted." Elias exchanged glances with Kyra and Benjamin, then nodded. "Fine. As long as the statement clearly states the truth. Aurelia failed to treat black passengers with fairness and commits to change with concrete steps. No euphemisms, no excuses." Palmer swallowed hard, then replied, "Agreed." The room seemed to fracture and reform in that moment, its silence no longer the silence of denial, but of history being made. Elias leaned back, his heart pounding. He had flipped the board entirely, from being humiliated in the cabin of a plane to forcing an entire airline to bow. Dr. Alicia Foster leaned toward him and whispered, "You just turned the page of history, Elias." He did not answer. He only gazed out the tall glass windows where Chicago gleamed under new sunlight. In his heart, his father's voice echoed, "When you stand, stand for more than yourself." 2 weeks after the historic confrontation, the news exploded across every front page. "Aurelia Air issues public apology and announces full-scale reform," blared the Wall Street Journal. The article detailed the airline's commitments: the termination of Colin Mercer and Bethany Reed, the appointment of a chief diversity and inclusion officer, and the complete overhaul of its booking system. On television, Gregory Palmer stood before dozens of cameras, his voice trembling. "We admit our mistakes, and we commit to change so that no passenger will ever again face such unfair treatment." Behind those words was the immense pressure from Elias Munro and Nexora Technologies. The world called it the 2A Ultimatum, the event that had shaken the entire airline industry. In Nexora's high-rise office, Elias watched the broadcast with only the faintest curve of his lips. He was not triumphant nor celebratory. What he felt was a quiet certainty that a measure of justice had been restored. Kyra entered, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "They just released the numbers. Passenger satisfaction among minorities has risen 20% in just 2 weeks. Other airlines are starting to conduct their own reviews to avoid becoming the next example." Elias nodded slightly. "That's the effect I wanted. Not just Aurelia, but the entire industry." His phone lit up with a message from Jonathan Reed, CEO of Apex Industries. "Elias, we want to resume negotiations. The way you handled Aurelia shows that you are more than a tech founder. You are a true leader. Meeting next week. Bring your revised proposal." Elias read it, his eyes glowing. The deal once thought lost had returned, stronger than ever, and on his terms. 3 months later in New York, the signing ceremony took place. The contract between Nexora and Apex was valued at $1.5 billion, $300 million more than the original agreement. The entire hall rose to applaud as Elias signed the final page. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Munro, how does it feel to go from a passenger forced into seat 28C to the CEO closing the biggest tech deal of the year?" Elias smiled, his voice deep and steady. "It feels like sometimes personal humiliation becomes the spark for change." I didn't stand just for myself. I stood for everyone who has ever been pushed aside because someone thought they didn't belong. Meanwhile, Aurelia Air was changing day by day. The new Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Dr. Maya Collins, launched mandatory training programs. At first, many employees resisted, but gradually the culture began to shift. The company's internal reports showed complaints dropping to the lowest level in a decade. One day, Elias received an unexpected email from Sarah Reed, the flight attendant who once mocked him. I attended the training. I see now the blindness I carried. I now work with a non-profit, teaching about unconscious bias. I don't ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know I am trying to become better. Elias read it in silence. He did not forget, but he understood. Justice was not only about punishment, but also about giving the chance to change. 6 months later, at a national leadership conference, Elias was invited as the keynote speaker. Before 2,000 executives, he began with calm conviction. True change does not come from easy moments. It comes from the times when we are humiliated, excluded, yet still decide not to bow our heads. My story is not about one first-class seat. It is a reminder that justice is a birthright, not a privilege. The hall erupted in thunderous applause. That night, back in Chicago, Elias stood at the window of his penthouse apartment. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his mother. An old photo of his father in a prison uniform, a sad smile, but proud eyes. Beneath it, she had written, "If he were still alive, he would be proud of you. You did what your father never had the chance to do." Elias clutched the phone, his eyes glistening. He whispered, "I kept my promise, Father. I stood tall. And this time, I stood for all." 1 year after the Seat 2A incident, the U.S. airline industry released a special report. Discrimination complaints had fallen by 45%, and many airlines had adopted diversity programs. The media called it the Monroe Effect. Elias Monroe, once forced into coach, was now hailed as the symbol of a new generation of CEOs, not only successful, but willing to use power to change the system. High above the skies, where humiliation once marked his journey, his name was now etched into history. That day in the skies, Elias Monroe lost a first-class seat, but in return, he won an entire revolution. This story is not just about one man's justice. It is a reminder that every person deserves respect, no matter their skin color or status. If you believe that change begins with the courage to stand up, then press like to help this story spread. Subscribe so you don't miss the journeys ahead, and leave a comment with just 2 words, "Stand up," to show that you too are part of the fight for justice.